Do you want to know what the secret is to a lasting marriage? Well, one of my favorite creators on YouTube just got married. Congratulations, by the way. He sent an email out asking for advice on how to have a happy, healthy, long-term marriage. And I feel like I am particularly qualified to answer this because I've been with my husband for 30 years. And he's still my favorite person after all this time. But we've been practicing something called a fourth step. And this is taken from the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. It is a process of resolving resentment. And I would argue that resentment is probably the number one reason why couples drift apart. So you need a process to resolve that. So very early on in our relationship, what would happen if something came up? If I got upset about something, I would go to a friend of mine. I called her my sponsor, and I would say, hey, Bobby did this and Bobby did that. And she would look at me and she would listen patiently, and she would say, well, I don't sponsor him, so we're gonna talk about your part. The beginning of the process is you identify the specific cause of the resentment. And I remember, this is the example I always use when I explain this process, is my husband and I were dating at the time, and we went out to dinner and we were saving money for our wedding. And I was a total miser. I was very tight with a dollar. And he was very, shall we say, generous. I actually said frivolous, but let's just call it generous. So we were out to dinner with another couple, and the bill came, and they thought it'd be a great idea to leave this gal a really big tip. And I was like, his friend, he was a baller, whatever. He had a lot of money. We did not. I got really upset and uptight. I don't remember what I said because this was a really long time ago, but I'm pretty sure I made everybody uncomfortable. That was a good time. When I finally get home, we were arguing about how we spend money, but then I called my sponsor and I was like, look, this is what he did. And she's like, look, we have to get really clear about why you are resentful. And I was like, well, he made me look bad. We all know that I made me look bad, but let's just, for the sake of our argument. So I was like, he's making me look bad. He's being very frivolous. We're trying to save money, and he's just blowing all this money for no reason. That was the specific cause. It was about the money. And she's like, well, what's really going on? What's the fear underneath that? Like, how are you affected? So we got the cause. I was upset about the money. And then she said, well, how is this affecting you? And I was like, well, if he cared about how I felt, then he wouldn't be spending money like this, right? That he would take my feelings into consideration, that he would be a little more frugal and not be wasteful about money. And she was like, okay, well, what's the fear underneath that? And when I really stopped to think about it, the fear was that he didn't care about how I felt, that it was more important for him to look good in front of his friends than it was to save money. And the fear was that we weren't going to have enough money for the wedding. And then she's like, okay, well, what is your part in all this? What is your part? And when it really came down to it, I had it in my mind that things should go a certain way. I wanted the wedding to be a certain way. I wanted us to save our money in a certain way. And all I was thinking about is what I wanted. I wasn't thinking about how he felt. And so this is where you kind of do this turnaround and go, what is my responsibility? Where am I being selfish, self-centered, self-seeking? And when she and I continued to talk about it, I got really clear about how I must have made him feel, how I embarrassed him in front of his friend, about how my controlling behavior, my self-centeredness was actually making him feel. So we talked about it until I got to a place of empathy for how I made him feel. And then once I was able to really own it, this whole process is about owning your own feelings. Like, I was actually holding him responsible for my happiness. And it's really not his job. Once I worked through all of this, I was ready to go back to him and talk to him and accept responsibility for my behavior. Meanwhile, he was doing the same thing with his support people, right? He had a sponsor. And so he was doing this whole process on his end. And when we came back together, I wasn't going to talk about his part. I was only going to take responsibility for my behavior, and he was doing the same thing. So when we came together, I was defenseless and he was defenseless, and I was taking responsibility for how I made him feel, and he was taking responsibility for how he made me feel. And that absolutely dissolved any kind of resentment. All the resentment and hard feelings just dissolved. So we have practiced the same process for 30 years now, and we don't have any resentment between us. When something comes up, like, listen, we've been together for so long that like stuff doesn't really come up. Like, we've worked all our shit out by now. It's been a long time, but it was a practice, and it was all about being willing to take responsibility for yourself and being willing to make amends to the other person. That's how we've done it. It's been 30 years, and he's still my best friend. He makes me laugh. He's the love of my life, and that's my advice for how to stay married for a very long time.